"Don't drink that," she said softly. And for a moment, no one at the table understood why those 4 words would matter more than the $100 million deal sitting in front of them. The room was warm with polished wood and low amber lighting, the kind of place where every glass sparkled and every voice stayed just below a whisper, where deals were made with nods instead of handshakes, and where men like Daniel Whitmore never expected to be interrupted, especially not by someone in a black apron carrying a tray of drinks. Emily Carter moved quietly between tables, her steps measured, her posture calm, almost invisible in the way that only the most observant people can be, blending into the background while noticing everything in the foreground: the slight tilt of a bottle, the uneven reflection on a glass, the way a hand lingered just a second too long where it shouldn't. Daniel didn't notice her at first, not really, because men like him rarely did, his attention fixed on the contract laid out in front of him, numbers lining up like certainty, control wrapped in ink and paper, his silver watch catching the light as he reached for the crystal glass placed just to his right, a deep red liquid resting inside, as still as the room itself. Around him, executives leaned in, voices low, confident, rehearsed, each word measured in millions, each pause calculated. And yet Emily's eyes weren't on the contract. They weren't on the men. They were on the glass, just the glass, because something about it didn't sit right. Not in a way she could explain immediately, not in a way that would make sense if spoken out loud, but in a way that made her slow down, just enough, just long enough to notice what everyone else missed. It was small, almost nothing, the kind of detail most people would dismiss without a second thought. The color catching the light just a shade too dark near the rim, the way the condensation formed unevenly along the side, and more than that, the memory of a hand she had seen minutes earlier, a server she didn't recognize, switching trays near the service station with a glance that didn't belong in a place like this. Emily didn't rush, she didn't panic. Because panic draws attention and attention changes outcomes, and something in her told her that timing, not volume, would decide what happened next. Daniel lifted the glass, his movements smooth, practiced, a man used to finishing actions without interruption, without doubt, without anyone questioning the next step. And that was when she spoke, not loud, not urgent, just enough to reach him, just enough to exist between one heartbeat and the next. "Don't drink that." The words hung there, fragile, almost out of place against the weight of wealth and certainty surrounding them. And for a brief second, Daniel paused, his fingers still wrapped around the glass, his eyes shifting toward her with a faint crease of irritation, as if trying to understand why something so small had managed to interrupt something so important. No one else reacted at first, not really. A few glances, a slight tightening of lips, the subtle discomfort of a moment that didn't follow the script, because in rooms like this, nothing unexpected is ever welcomed, especially not from someone who isn't supposed to be seen, let alone heard. Emily didn't explain, she didn't step forward, she didn't repeat herself, she just stood there, steady, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the glass, as if the answer was already there waiting for someone else to catch up. Daniel let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff, the kind that dismisses without fully committing, his grip tightening slightly as he lifted the glass higher, testing the moment, testing her, testing whether this interruption was worth anything at all. And around him, the room leaned in just a little, not because they believed her, but because something in the stillness had shifted, something subtle, something that made even certainty hesitate, if only for a second. Daniel Whitmore did not lower the glass, not immediately, but he did not drink either. And that hesitation, that fraction of a second where certainty loosened its grip, was enough to ripple through the room in a way no one could quite explain, because men like Daniel were known for decisiveness, for moving forward without pause, without doubt, without anyone influencing the direction of their next move. Yet here he was, holding still, his eyes narrowing slightly as they shifted from the deep red liquid to the woman standing beside him, as if trying to measure her words against everything he believed about control and logic and the order of things. "Excuse me," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with something sharper, not anger, not yet, but the beginning of it, the kind that comes when authority is questioned in a place where it rarely is. Around the table, the others exchanged brief glances, subtle, controlled, but unmistakably curious now, Because the interruption had stretched just long enough to become something more than a passing inconvenience. And curiosity, in rooms like this, spreads quickly when it senses a break in certainty. Emily did not rush to fill the silence. She did not offer an explanation or soften her tone, because explanations can sound like apologies, and apologies weaken truth. And something in her told her that what mattered here was not convincing him, but giving him the space to notice what she had already seen. "It is just a suggestion," she said quietly, her voice even, her posture unchanged, as if she had said nothing unusual at all, as if warning a billionaire in the middle of a multi-million-dollar negotiation was simply part of her shift. Daniel let out a short breath through his nose, the hint of a restrained smile touching his lips, the kind that appears when someone believes they are being tested and intends to pass on their own terms. And without breaking eye contact, he tilted the glass slightly, watching the liquid move inside it, slow, controlled, deliberate, as if the answer might reveal itself through motion alone. Nothing happened, not outwardly, not in a way that would justify stopping, and yet something in the stillness remained, something unresolved, something that refused to settle back into normal. One of the executives leaned back in his chair, clearing his throat softly, trying to restore the rhythm of the meeting, to guide the moment back into familiar territory. "Daniel, we should probably continue. The numbers are already aligned," he said, his tone careful, respectful, but with an undercurrent of impatience that came from a man who valued momentum over mystery. Daniel did not respond right away, his attention still divided, part of him anchored in the deal, in the structure, in the logic that had built his empire, and part of him, unexpectedly, drawn to the quiet certainty in Emily's eyes, the absence of hesitation, the lack of performance. Because if she had been nervous, if she had faltered, if she had tried to explain too much, he would have dismissed her instantly. But she did none of those things. She simply stood there, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond his understanding. The glass hovered just inches from his lips now, close enough that the faint aroma reached him, familiar, expensive, curated, exactly what he had ordered, exactly what it was supposed to be. And yet, just as he began to tilt it further, a voice from behind interrupted, light, casual, almost careless. "Mind if I try that?" A junior associate, younger, eager, the kind who filled gaps without being asked, stepped forward with an easy smile, reaching for the glass before Daniel could respond. The gesture quick, uncalculated, the kind of small disruption that happens in crowded rooms where people assume everything is safe, everything is controlled. For the first time, Emily moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a single step forward, her hand lifting slightly as if to speak again, but stopping short, her eyes fixed on the glass as it changed hands, as if the moment had shifted beyond words, beyond warnings, into something that would have to reveal itself on its own. The young associate took the glass with an easy confidence, the kind that comes from believing the world is exactly as it appears, safe, structured, predictable, and he gave a small, almost apologetic smile toward Daniel as if to lighten the moment, as if this interruption could be smoothed over with charm and a quick sip, because in his mind, nothing unusual had happened, nothing that required pause or concern, just a minor delay in a room built on momentum. Daniel did not stop him, not because he agreed, but because something inside him wanted to see the moment play out, wanted proof, one way or another, that the quiet warning either meant nothing or meant everything. And that need for clarity held him still more effectively than any doubt ever could. Emily's eyes followed the glass, not the man, not the table, just the glass, her expression unchanged, but her stillness now carried a different weight, as if she had already stepped past the point where words could alter what came next. The associate lifted the glass slightly, inspecting it with casual curiosity, swirling the liquid once as if mimicking Daniel's earlier motion, then bringing it closer, the faint scent rising, familiar, refined, exactly what it was supposed to be, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to return to normal, the tension dissolving into something almost awkward, almost unnecessary. A few quiet chuckles began to form around the table, restrained, polite, the kind that suggested the interruption would soon become a story, a small, forgettable moment in an otherwise successful evening, and someone shifted in their chair, ready to steer the conversation back to numbers, to signatures, to the language they trusted. Then the associate paused. It was subtle, almost invisible, the kind of hesitation that could be mistaken for thought, but it lasted just long enough to break the rhythm again, his brows drawing together slightly, as if something did not quite align with expectation, as if the taste or the scent or something deeper had not matched the certainty he had assumed. He lowered the glass, just a fraction, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to create space, enough to make the silence return, heavier now, more aware. "That is strange," he said quietly, not with fear, not with urgency, but with confusion, the kind that carries more weight than either, because confusion suggests something unseen, something unresolved, something that does not fit into the pattern everyone thought they understood. Daniel's gaze sharpened instantly, the casual edge gone, replaced by focus, by calculation, by the same instinct that had built his empire, the instinct that recognizes when something does not belong. He reached out, not to take the glass back, but to steady it, his fingers brushing the base as he leaned closer, studying the liquid with a precision that mirrored Emily's earlier attention. And for the first time, he saw it. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. A slight variation near the rim, a faint inconsistency that should not exist in something so carefully curated. The room did not erupt, it did not react loudly, but it shifted, conversations halted, movements slowed, and every eye, whether intentionally or not, drifted toward the same point, the same glass, the same unanswered question hanging between them. Emily did not step forward again. She did not claim anything. She simply stood where she was, her presence steady, her silence now louder than any explanation could have been, because in that moment, everyone understood that she had not spoken out of impulse. She had spoken because she had already seen what they were only beginning to notice. No one spoke for a moment, not because they did not have questions, but because something in the room had shifted from assumption to awareness, and that kind of shift does not invite noise. It demands attention. Daniel slowly straightened, his hand still resting lightly against the base of the glass, not touching the liquid, not disturbing it, just anchoring it in place as his mind moved through possibilities with quiet precision, eliminating what could not be true and focusing on what remained. Because in his world, details were never accidents. They were signals, and signals always pointed somewhere. "Where did this come from?" he asked, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that cut through the room more effectively than any raised voice could have. And immediately, the energy around the table tightened, posture adjusted, eyes sharpened, because now the question was no longer about a drink. It was about control, and control, once questioned, does not easily return. A senior manager gestured subtly toward the service station, his confidence thinner now. "It was poured moments ago, from a fresh bottle. Everything was handled according to standard," he said, his words careful, measured, but lacking the certainty they had carried just minutes earlier. Daniel did not look at him. His gaze remained on the glass, on the faint irregularity that now seemed impossible to ignore, because once seen, truth has a way of refusing to disappear. "Standard does not produce inconsistencies," Daniel replied quietly, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any accusation, because it left no room for interpretation, only for answers. Somewhere behind them, a chair shifted, the soft sound echoing louder than it should have, and a figure near the service station hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation that only becomes visible when everyone is already looking for something out of place. Emily noticed it first, not because she was closer, but because she had never stopped observing, her attention moving naturally from the glass to the room, from the detail to the pattern, connecting what others still saw as separate moments into something continuous, something meaningful. She did not point, she did not speak immediately, because pointing draws attention to the person, not the truth, and she understood that what mattered now was not her, but what the room itself was beginning to reveal. Daniel followed the silence, not the movement, but the absence of it, the subtle break in rhythm that did not belong, and his eyes lifted, scanning the space with a calm intensity that made people straighten instinctively, as if the act of being seen by him required adjustment. The service station stood just beyond the edge of the main dining area, polished, orderly, exactly as it should be, And yet one server stood slightly apart, his posture not quite aligned with the rest, his focus fixed a little too firmly on something that was no longer relevant, and that was enough. "You," Daniel said, his voice still controlled, still even, but now directed, precise, and the word alone shifted the air again, drawing every glance toward the same point, toward the man who had just become visible in a room where invisibility had once protected him. The server looked up, startled, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to confirm what had already begun to form in Daniel's mind, enough to make the uncertainty settle into something closer to truth. Emily finally moved then, just one step forward, her presence aligning with the direction of attention, not leading it, not claiming it, just reinforcing what had already been discovered. Her voice soft when she spoke, but unmistakably clear. "He switched the tray," she said, not as an accusation, not as a guess, but as a simple statement. The kind that does not need to be defended because it was never uncertain to begin with. And in that moment, the room did not react with shock or chaos. It reacted with understanding, quiet, collective, undeniable understanding that what had seemed like a small interruption had in fact revealed something much larger, something that had been hidden in plain sight until someone chose to notice. The word hung in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it was certain, and certainty, when it comes from the unexpected, has a way of silencing everything else. The server froze, not completely, not in a way that would draw immediate attention if no one had been watching, but just enough, just long enough for the shift to register in a room now trained to notice every deviation, every hesitation, every detail that did not align with the polished surface of control they had all trusted minutes earlier. Daniel did not move right away. He did not raise his voice or call for security, because escalation without understanding creates noise, and noise hides truth, and what he wanted now was clarity, clean, precise, undeniable. "Explain," he said, his tone steady, directed not with anger, but with expectation, the kind that assumes an answer already exists and is simply waiting to be revealed. The server swallowed, his hands adjusting slightly at his sides, an unconscious attempt to regain composure, to return to a role that no longer fit the moment. And when he spoke, his voice carried just enough strain to confirm what the room had already begun to understand. "It was nothing," he said quickly, too quickly, the words landing without weight, without structure, the kind of response that tries to close a door that has already been opened. Emily did not look at him. She did not need to, because the pattern had already formed in her mind, each small detail aligning into something coherent, something that no longer required speculation. And yet she remained still, allowing the truth to surface on its own, because forced conclusions often invite resistance, but observed ones leave no room for denial. Daniel's gaze did not waver, his attention fixed, not aggressive, not confrontational, but absolute, the kind of focus that makes evasion feel impossible without a single step forward. "Nothing does not alter a sealed system," he said calmly, his hand lifting slightly to indicate the glass, the liquid inside still untouched, still waiting, now less an object and more a question. Around the room, the silence deepened, not empty, but full, charged with awareness, with realization, with the quiet understanding that something intentional had occurred in a place designed to eliminate intention outside of agreement and contract. The server shifted his weight, a small movement, but enough to break whatever composure he had been trying to hold, and his eyes flickered, not toward Daniel, not toward the executives, but briefly, instinctively, toward the exit, and that was all it took. Daniel saw it, the direction, the impulse, the unspoken admission contained in a glance, and for the first time since the moment began, he moved, not abruptly, not forcefully, just a single step that closed distance, not physically, but psychologically, the space between uncertainty and conclusion narrowing into something final. "You switched it," Daniel said, not as a question, not even as an accusation, but as a statement that required no response to be true. The server's shoulders dropped slightly, the smallest release of tension, the kind that comes when holding something in place becomes harder than letting it go. And though he did not immediately confess, he did not deny it either, and in that absence of denial, the room found its answer. Emily finally exhaled, not in relief, not in triumph, but in quiet confirmation, her gaze shifting away from the glass for the first time, because the moment that had once been uncertain had now resolved itself into something clear, something understood by everyone present without the need for further explanation. Daniel turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her again. Really look this time, not as background, not as interruption, but as the person who had seen what no one else had, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge, carrying something new, something closer to respect. "How did you know?" he asked, and the question was not about the glass anymore. It was about her, about the quiet certainty that had altered the course of a moment no one else had even realized needed altering. And in that question, the balance in the room shifted once more, not through power, but through recognition. Emily did not answer immediately, not because she did not have one, but because the kind of answer Daniel was asking for could not be rushed without losing its meaning, and meaning, once diluted, becomes something else entirely. She glanced briefly at the glass again, then back at him, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the moment had already settled for her while everyone else was still catching up. "It did not match," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear, the kind that did not compete with the room but still reached every corner of it. Daniel's brow tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus, because those words were not an explanation, they were a direction, and he was a man who understood how to follow direction when it pointed toward truth. "What did not match?" he asked, and this time there was no impatience in his tone, only intent, only attention. Emily shifted her weight just slightly, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture still composed, still grounded, as if she had learned long ago that calm reveals more than urgency ever could. "The color near the rim," she said, her gaze returning to the glass. It was slightly darker than the rest, not by much, but enough. A few of the executives leaned in, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet curiosity, because now they were being invited to see what they had missed, to step into a level of observation they had not considered necessary before. "And the condensation," she continued. It formed unevenly, like the glass had been handled differently than the others on the tray. Daniel followed her words, his eyes narrowing again as he examined the details she pointed out, and for the first time, he saw them clearly, not as anomalies, but as evidence, small, precise, undeniable. That could still be accidental. One of the men at the table said cautiously, his voice careful, as if testing whether logic could still reclaim control of the moment. Emily nodded once, not dismissing him, not challenging him, just acknowledging the possibility before continuing. "It could be," she said, "if not for the tray." Daniel's gaze lifted slightly, aligning with hers, the connection immediate, because now they were no longer looking at separate details, they were looking at a sequence. "He switched it," she said again, softer this time, almost as if confirming something that had already been accepted. "I saw him near the service station, holding 2 trays, one with your glass, one without, and he hesitated before placing them down." The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer uncertain, it was absorbing, processing, aligning itself with a truth that had been revealed piece by piece. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was understood, and understanding, to him, was always the first step toward control. "You noticed all that in seconds," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the clarity that had just been established. Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as a display of confidence, but as a simple acknowledgement of fact. "You learn to notice when you are not expected to be seen," she replied, and the sentence settled into the room with a weight that had nothing to do with the glass, nothing to do with the server, but everything to do with her. Daniel looked at her differently now, not as someone who had interrupted his evening, but as someone who had altered it in a way he could not ignore, his eyes holding on her for a moment longer than necessary, as if recalibrating something internal, something that had just shifted without permission. Around them, the room remained still, not frozen, but attentive, every detail now carrying meaning, every movement now subject to a level of awareness that had not existed before she spoke. And in that quiet recalibration, It became clear to everyone present that the most important thing that had happened that night was not the deal, not the numbers, not the signatures waiting on the table, but the moment a single observation had changed everything. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because once attention has been sharpened, it does not dull on command. It lingers, it recalibrates, it forces everything to be seen with a little more clarity than before. Daniel slowly released the glass, setting it back onto the table with deliberate care, not out of caution, but out of acknowledgement, because what it represented now was no longer a drink. It was a moment he had nearly misjudged, and that realization did not sit lightly with a man who built his life on precision. "Have him escorted out," he said quietly, not raising his voice, not turning toward anyone specific. Yet the instruction carried through the room instantly, because authority, when it is certain, does not need to be loud to be followed. Movement resumed, subtle but coordinated, as a member of the staff approached the server, speaking in low tones, guiding him away without spectacle, without disruption, as if even this needed to be handled with the same quiet control that defined everything else in the room. No one commented, no one reacted outwardly, but the absence of resistance, the absence of denial, confirmed what had already been understood, and within seconds, the space where the server had stood was empty, leaving behind nothing but the trace of a mistake that had almost gone unnoticed. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze drifting briefly across the table, across the contract, across the men who had come prepared to finalize something significant, and yet none of it felt as immediate as it had before, because perspective, once shifted, does not easily return to its original shape. He turned back to Emily, not quickly, not dramatically, but with intention, as if this next part required the same level of attention she had given the moment earlier. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, marked a change, because it was no longer directed at a role, but at a person. "Emily Carter," she replied, her voice steady, unchanged, as if nothing about the situation had altered her position in the room, even though everything else had. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, committing it to memory in the same way he would commit a critical data point, something that might matter again later. "Emily," he repeated, not as a test, but as recognition, and for a brief second, there was something unguarded in his expression, not vulnerability, but something close, something that suggested recalibration rather than control. One of the executives shifted in his seat, clearing his throat again, more carefully this time, as if aware that the rhythm of the room had been rewritten and he needed to adapt to it rather than restore it. "Should we continue?" he asked, his tone respectful, measured, but no longer assuming that the answer would be immediate. Daniel did not respond right away, his attention still anchored to the moment that had just passed, to the realization that something significant had been prevented not by systems, not by protocols, but by a single observation from someone no one had been watching. He glanced once more at the glass, then back at Emily, and something in his posture shifted, subtle, but undeniable, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes the way a person stands in a room. "We will," he said finally, his voice calm, controlled, but different now, carrying a layer of awareness that had not been there before. "But first," he paused, just long enough to make the room listen again. "Bring a new bottle, sealed, and open it here." The request was simple, procedural, but the intention behind it was not, because it was no longer about the drink. It was about ensuring that what had nearly been overlooked would never be overlooked again. Emily nodded once, turning without haste, her steps as measured as before, but now, every movement she made carried a different weight, not because she had changed, but because the room had finally adjusted to her presence, and in that quiet adjustment, something unspoken settled into place, not announced, not celebrated, but understood by everyone there, that the most important person in the room had never been the one holding the contract, but the one who had chosen to notice. When Emily returned, the room was no longer the same room she had left just moments earlier, not because anything visible had changed, but because everyone inside it was now paying attention in a way they had not before, their posture slightly straighter, their eyes more deliberate, as if the invisible layer of certainty that once guided them had been replaced by something quieter, something more careful. She carried the bottle in both hands, the label facing outward, the seal intact, every detail presented clearly without needing to be announced. And as she approached the table, the soft glow of the overhead lights caught the glass, reflecting in small, precise lines that seemed sharper than before. Daniel watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with focus, the same kind of attention he once reserved only for numbers and negotiations, now redirected toward the process itself, toward the act of ensuring, rather than assuming. She placed the bottle gently on the table, the sound barely audible, then paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to let the moment settle, just enough to make the action intentional rather than routine. With steady hands, she broke the seal, the quiet snap cutting through the silence like a signal, clean, unmistakable, and every eye followed the movement, not because it was dramatic, but because it mattered now. She poured the wine slowly, evenly, the liquid flowing into a new glass, untouched, unhandled, controlled from start to finish. And when she stepped back, she did not say anything. She did not present it with flourish. She simply allowed it to exist, complete, verified, certain. Daniel did not reach for it immediately, not this time, because something in him had shifted from reflex to intention, and he studied the glass for a moment, not searching for flaws, but acknowledging the absence of them, the difference between what had been and what now was. Around him, the others remained quiet, their earlier impatience replaced by something closer to respect, not just for the situation, but for the process, for the understanding that had been introduced into a space that once relied on speed and confidence alone. Daniel finally lifted the glass, his movement slower than before, more deliberate, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's, as if confirming something unspoken, something that no longer needed to be explained. He gave a slight nod, not a formal gesture, not exaggerated, but enough to recognize what had been done, what had been prevented, and what had been revealed. Then, and only then, he took a measured sip, the action simple, controlled, but now carrying a different meaning entirely, because it was no longer about the drink. It was about trust, rebuilt not through authority, but through observation. He set the glass down gently, the faint sound echoing with a finality that felt earned, not assumed. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the silence now was not uncertainty, it was understanding. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but grounded, his gaze sweeping across the table once more before returning to Emily. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something quieter, but stronger than before. "Stay," he said, not as a command, not as an order, but as an invitation, a recognition that her presence in the room was no longer incidental. Emily paused, just briefly, her expression unchanged, but her stillness now held a different weight, because she understood what the word meant, not in terms of position, but in terms of value. She gave a small nod, stepping slightly to the side, not taking a seat, not inserting herself into the conversation, but remaining within it, within the awareness that had been created. The meeting resumed, voices returning, numbers revisited, agreements refined, but everything moved differently now, not slower, but more precise, as if each person at the table had learned, without being told, that what is unseen is often what matters most, and that sometimes the difference between assumption and attention is everything. The signatures came one after another, smooth, deliberate, each name placed with the same precision that had defined the entire evening. But something about the act felt different now, not heavier, not slower, but more aware, as if every decision carried a deeper weight than numbers alone could measure. Daniel Whitmore set his pen down last, his gaze resting briefly on the final page before closing the folder, the soft sound echoing with a quiet sense of completion, not just of the deal, but of the moment that had reshaped how he saw everything that led to it. Around the table, conversations resumed in low tones, relief mixing with satisfaction. But beneath it all, there remained an undercurrent of reflection, a shared understanding that something important had happened beyond the contract itself, something that would not be written down, but would not be forgotten either. Emily remained where she had stepped aside earlier, her presence steady, unobtrusive, as if nothing about her role had changed, even though the room itself had shifted around her, adjusting, recalibrating, recognizing. She did not seek acknowledgement. She did not move closer. She simply continued to observe, the same way she always had, because for her, nothing about this was new, only the way others now perceived it. Daniel stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with a familiar motion, but when he turned, his attention went directly to her, not as an afterthought, not as a passing courtesy, but as something intentional. The distance between them was not far, just a few steps, but it carried a significance that neither of them needed to define. "You changed the outcome of tonight," he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a sincerity that had not been present before, not because he was incapable of it, but because he had rarely needed to express it. Emily met his gaze, not lowering her eyes, not stepping back, just holding the moment as it was, without adding to it, without diminishing it. "I noticed something," she replied, her tone simple, almost understated, as if the scale of what had happened did not require embellishment, only accuracy. Daniel studied her for a second longer, as if weighing the difference between what she said and what she had actually done, and in that brief silence, something settled in him, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, sleek card, placing it gently on the table between them, not sliding it forward, not insisting, just offering it as something that could be taken or left. "If you ever decide that noticing is not enough," he said, his voice quieter now, "there is a place where it matters even more." Emily glanced at the card, her eyes lingering for a fraction of a second before returning to him, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of a smile, not wide, not obvious, just enough to acknowledge the gesture without accepting it outright. "It already matters," she said, and the simplicity of her answer carried a depth that no title or position could easily replace. Daniel nodded once, not pushing further, not trying to convince her, because something in her response made it clear that value, to her, was not defined by proximity to power, but by the clarity with which she chose to see the world. He picked up the card again, sliding it back into his pocket, not withdrawn, just deferred, as if understanding that some decisions do not belong to the moment they are offered in. The room began to shift back into motion, chairs moving, quiet goodbyes exchanged, the evening drawing to a close. But the energy that remained was different, not driven by urgency or success, but by something quieter, something that lingered in the spaces between words. Emily turned to leave, her steps as measured as they had always been, her presence returning to the background where it had started. But now, the background itself felt different, not because she had changed, but because everyone else had finally learned to see it. And as the lights dimmed slightly and the last voices faded, one truth remained, steady and undeniable, that the people who speak the least are often the ones who understand the most, and that sometimes the quietest. Observation can change everything.